Chapter 37. A Human Skull. It would be impossible to describe the succession of emotions which seized hold of Professor Liedenbrock: stupefaction, incredulity, and finally anger. I have never seen a man so startled at first and so furious afterwards. The fatigues of the crossing, the dangers we had undergone, had all to be repeated. But my uncle rapidly regained control of himself. "So, fate is having fun with me, is it?" he cried. "The elements are in league against me. Air, fire, and water combine to block my way? Well, they are going to find out just how strong-willed I am. I won't give in. I won't move back an inch, and we shall see whether man or nature will get the upper hand." Standing on the rock, angry and menacing, Otto Liedenbrock, like Ajax, seemed to be hurling defiance at the gods. But I thought it best to intervene and put a check on his wild fury. "Listen to me," I said firmly. "There is a limit to every sort of ambition in this world, and we can't do the impossible. We are ill-equipped for a sea voyage, because nobody can sail 1,000 miles on a collection of rotten beams, with a blanket for a sail, a stick for a mast, and a contrary wind blowing. Unable to steer and at the mercy of every storm, we should be mad to try that impossible crossing a second time." I was able to expound these irrefutable arguments for 10 minutes without interruption, but simply because the professor was not taking any notice of me and did not hear a single word I said. "To the raft!" he cried. That was his only reply. It was no use my arguing, begging, losing my temper. I came up against a will harder than granite. Hans had just finished repairing the raft, as if the strange creature had guessed my uncle's intentions. He strengthened the craft with a few pieces of surturbrand. A sail had already been run up, and the wind was playing in its folds. The professor said a few words to the guide, who promptly placed all our effects on board and got ready to cast off. The sky was fairly clear, and the wind blowing steadily from the northwest. What could I do? Stand up to the two of them? That was impossible. If only Hans had taken my side. But the Icelander seemed to have renounced all will of his own and taken a vow of abnegation. I could not get anything out of a servant so futilely devoted to his master. There was nothing to be done but press on. I was therefore going to take my usual place on the raft, when my uncle placed his hand on my shoulder. "We shan't leave till tomorrow," he said. I made a gesture of complete resignation. "I must neglect nothing," he said, "and since fate has driven me onto this part of the coast, I won't leave it until I have explored it." This remark will be understood when I explain that, if we had returned to the North Shore, it was not at the place from which we had started. Port Gräuben, we decided, must be farther west. Nothing could be more sensible, therefore, than to make a thorough inspection of this new region. "Let's start exploring," I said. And leaving Hans to his work, we set off. The space between the water and the foot of the cliffs was extremely wide at this point. It would take half an hour to reach the wall of rock. We were crushing underfoot countless shells of all shapes and sizes in which prehistoric creatures had lived. I also noticed some huge carapaces, over 15 feet in diameter, which had belonged to those gigantic glyptodons of the Pliocene period, of which the modern tortoise is just a greatly reduced copy. The ground was also strewn with stones, arranged in rows and looking like pebbles rounded by the waves. This led me to think that the sea must have covered this region at one time. On the scattered rocks, which were now out of their reach, the waves had left clear traces of their passage. This could explain up to a certain point the existence of this ocean 100 miles below the surface of the earth. This liquid mass, which in my opinion was bound to flow away gradually into the bowels of the earth, had obviously penetrated from the sea above through some fissure. Yet it had to be supposed that the fissure was now closed, for otherwise the whole of this cavern, or rather this huge reservoir, would have filled up in a fairly short time. Perhaps, too, this water, subjected to the action of the subterranean fires, had evaporated to some extent. This would account for the clouds over our heads and the development of that electricity which created storms in the interior of the earth. This theory about the phenomena we had witnessed struck me as satisfactory, for however great the wonders of nature may be, They can always be explained by physical laws. We were therefore walking on a sort of sedimentary soil, deposited by the waters like all the terrains of that period on the surface of the globe. The professor carefully examined every fissure in the rocks. Whenever he saw a hole, it became a matter of importance for him to discover its depths. We had followed the shores of the Liedenbrock Sea for a mile when the ground suddenly changed in appearance. It looked as if it had been shaken and convulsed by a violent upheaval of the lower strata. In a good many places, hollows or hillocks bore witness to a massive dislocation of the rock. We were advancing with difficulty over these granite fragments, mingled with flint, quartz, and alluvial deposits, when we were suddenly confronted with a field, or rather a plain, covered with bones. It looked like a huge cemetery, containing the remains of 20 centuries of mankind. Great mounds of bones were piled up in row after row, stretching away to the horizon where they disappeared into the mist. There, within perhaps 3 square miles, was accumulated the entire history of animal life, a history scarcely sketched out in the 2 recent strata of the inhabited world. A burning curiosity impelled us forward. Our feet noisily cracked and crushed fossils and bones of prehistoric animals whose rare and interesting remains are a subject of contention between the museums of our great cities. 1,000 Cuviers, working all their lives, could not have constructed all the skeletons which lay in that magnificent ossuary. I was stupefied. My uncle had raised his long arms towards the thick vault which served us as the sky. His gaping mouth, his eyes flashing behind his spectacles, his head nodding up and down, and indeed his whole attitude denoted utter astonishment. He was faced with a priceless collection of Leptotheria, Maricotheria, Lophiodea, Anoplotheria, Megatheria, Mastodons, Protopithecae, pterodactyls, and other antediluvian monsters, all heaped up there for his personal satisfaction. Imagine a fanatical bibliomaniac suddenly transported into the middle of the famous library of Alexandria, which Omar burnt and which had suddenly been miraculously resurrected from its ashes. That's what my uncle was like. But he displayed amazement of a very different sort a little later, when, running through all this organic dust, he seized a bare skull and cried out in a voice trembling with excitement, "Axel! Axel! A human head!" "A human head, uncle?" I replied, no less astonished. "Yes, my boy. Oh, Mr. Milne Edwards. Oh, Monsieur de Quatrefages. If only you could be standing where I, Otto Liedenbrock, am standing now." And that's the end of chapter 37.